Hey guys, this is chapter 10, notes, and I wanted to start with showing you this graphic. This is the first link under your COVID-19 essay prompt this week, and it's pretty cool. This may not be the screen that you see when you first click on the link, but this is on this rectangular view, and I'm trying to make my mouse show up better. So you can click these different views and see some different examples of this, but what we're seeing here is how COVID-19 has changed over like from December 3rd all the way up until now and how it's diverged. And we're looking at nucleotide sequences here. We can look at this in different ways and it's pretty fun to play with. So I recommend like messing around. Hopefully your internet's not as slow as mine. And there you can see how it started here and then it diverged is the word that we use. So it actually changed. And we're looking at nucleotide mutations, and they actually know where these occurred. They know which people they sampled, and they can actually run these pretty quickly and figure out how they changed. We're not seeing a whole ton of mutations in COVID-19. It's not mutating as quickly as like influenza does, which is really bad with mutations. So that's good. That's good for like the long game. And then let me just click on some other ones here, which are pretty cool. So you can see here, this is another way to look at it. We've seen like phylogenetic trees like this where things branch out into different groups. And then this one's my favorite. This is the clock. So this actually shows over time how it's diverged. It started here from December 19th and this kind of starting point that they first analyzed the genome. And then here on the y-axis, these are how many mutations we're seeing. So we're only seeing like a few days ago, this was 21 substitutions per year, and now we're looking at 24, 25. So it might be going up, might be getting faster, but influenza is way faster. And then the other cool thing about this website is you can actually map this on a map to see where these mutations are. And I just pushed play. It'll play through like, this is where it started. A lot of these clusters they haven't figured out yet because it takes a lot of time to study this, but they know some of like where people traveled and then who they infected. And you hope you're never that guy that like ends up on a map infecting people, right? But the cool thing is if you're able to zoom up at the same time, can you kind of see the bottom of this graph? It's showing those mutations at the same time along with the graph, which I think is really cool. And so this section or this chapter, we're focusing on how things change. We're looking at evolution and how natural selection can occur. And the cool thing is we get to study this in this pandemic happening in real time. So that's what we're going to focus on in this chapter and how these mutations can happen. These mutations here are random mutations. They're not caused by anything. They just randomly happen. And then based on that, something changes. And coronavirus, there are many different coronaviruses. There are probably about 50 at least different types, and most of them are not dangerous. The ones that are COVID-19, SARS, and MERS. Those are the three. There are a whole bunch of other ones, like 50 or 100 that are fine and they don't harm us. And so the reason these harm us is because they give us symptoms that make us cough and spit and sneeze, and then that's transmitted to other people. That's why they make us sick. And like SARS and MERS went overboard, they made people too sick, and then they didn't cause a pandemic like this. And COVID-19 is a little different because it's very dangerous, but not as deadly as SARS and MERS, so it's going to cause a pandemic and change the way that we operate. So that's a really cool website that I encourage you to go to, but I'm going to close it now and switch over my sharing to my PowerPoint. You have this PowerPoint too, and I'm going to play it. Maybe. Okay, so I wanted to start with this idea here, this quote that I really like, because a lot of times, oops, it's not letting me go back. A lot of times evolution is kind of a bad word that we hear about, and I would like to challenge you with this quote from Aristotle. It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. And so no matter what you think about evolution, if you come in with some like preconceptions about it, I want you to have a chance to learn about it well. And if you think differently from this, that's fine, but you will have a really, hopefully a solid basis for understanding these mechanisms of evolution and what this word actually means. And then it's not a bad word. It's just these observations that we're making of the world and observations that we're making of COVID-19. And this is where COVID-19 came from, was from evolution. It evolved from some descendant like probably SARS-CoV. It was probably related to that. And we can look at the genome and look into that too. And if you want to do that for one of your projects, we can dig into that as well. So that's what I wanted to start with. So section 1 is on early ideas about evolution. And we're focusing on Darwin. So Darwin was probably as famous or more famous than Mendel, probably more famous. And he made observations of some interesting things. Sorry, my computer is just not working. Hopefully yours is faster. So he was looking at how organisms changed. And one cool example is the horse. Horse ancestry is really interesting because they started out really small, like little tiny dogs with lots of toes. And then as they evolved, they began to get much taller. And then these toes that they were walking on actually kind of became vestigial and moved up like this. Those are the chestnuts on their leg. And the middle finger and middle toe, those are actually their legs. The hoof is the fingernail. And so those are some really cool changes that we can track by looking at fossils. One rule that we need to know, though, is the second bullet here, the definition of a species. It's a group of organisms that can reproduce and have fertile offspring. And I think we've used that word before, but that's how we know if things are different species. We can't apply that definition to viruses because they don't reproduce and produce fertile offspring. So we look at like strains, which is tricky to know if they're really different or not functionally. Linnaeus was pretty important back in the 18th century in Darwin's time, and he was trying to figure out how to classify like what kingdom is it in, what phylum, what family. That's what Linnaeus was working on. Buffon looked at, he thought that species shared ancestors, so that was another step, that we have ancestors. And then this is Erasmus Darwin, E. Darwin, this is Darwin's grandfather, and he thought that there would be like less complex forms and then more complex forms would develop after them. So that's what he was looking at. And then Lamarck was the one guy that was wrong. He's kind of remembered for being wrong. But he said that environmental change causes changes. So like if the trees get taller, then giraffes' necks will get taller within their lifetime. And we know that's not true. Or like if I cut my arm off, my kids aren't going to be missing an arm. That would be a really bad way for organisms to change. So he was kind of wrong about that, and he had some good ideas too. So that kind of all set the stage for Darwin, but there are also some things happening in geology. There were some ideas of how geologic forms change, like volcanoes. Those are known as catastrophism because they happen like all at once and cause huge changes. Like when I was in Hawaii and a volcano erupted and it like erupted over the road, and so then all the maps were wrong. So that would be catastrophism. It causes huge changes really fast. Gradualism is more slow changes. So this is like the Grand Canyon with the Colorado River, and that caused erosion over a long time period. So that would be known as gradualism. And then the last one is uniformitarianism. And what that says is that however long things took way back then, they take the same amount of time now, or vice versa. So if it takes 1,000 years to make a valley, then it took 1,000 years way back then to also make a valley. That time was constant. So those are what those three ideas are. So those kind of set the stage for Darwin. And that's our first section. And I'm gonna go through the questions right now. So you can go through them as you go, or you can skip over this if you'd rather do that. So that was all of section 1. The first question is, which of the following is a term for a group of similar organisms that can reproduce and produce fertile offspring? So we said that was species. An example of that one is like a donkey and a horse. Those are not the same species. They produce a mule, which is not fertile. The next question is, which scientist proposed that if an organism used a structure so much it grew, a trait of that larger structure would be passed to its offspring? So this was a wrong idea. If they use their neck a lot, it's not going to grow and then be passed to their offspring, and that would be Lamarck. And then the past is the present to the key, or the past is the key to, wow, the present is the key to the past. Which one is that? So that is uniformitarianism. Whatever took, however long it took back then, it took now. Which of the following is a fossil? So that is a trace of an organism that existed in the past. And then the theory that landforms on Earth's surface, such as mountains, waterfalls, and canyons, were created as a result of a sudden spectacular events is called the theory of catastrophism. All right, so let's go to section 2. So now we're going to look at Darwin. Darwin was famous. He was actually trained in like religion. I think he was, not sure exactly what his training was, maybe a monk, that kind of thing. And then he became a naturalist, and he ended up going on this amazing voyage. He was the naturalist on like a cruise, and he went all around the Galapagos. He had this great trip. He started out, he's like really famous for his finches, but he started out studying tortoises. And he looked at 2 different islands, and he noticed that on one island they had really short necks. Oops. And on the other island, they had really long necks. And so he saw on the island that had like a lot of lush grass, they had shorter necks and shorter legs. And then the island that had like less vegetation, but had taller plants, they had taller necks and taller legs. And so you can see why Lamarck would think what he did. So this got Darwin thinking. He really was reflecting on this. He noticed other things about them too. And so one term that we need to know is what an adaptation is, and you have questions on this. So that's a feature, like a trait, that the organism has that helps it to survive better. And these organisms can survive over many generations. So one guy cannot adapt. It has to be over many generations that, that they're forming these adaptations. And this can lead to a genetic change. So if we see some of them like mating and having babies and surviving, then we're going to see some changes to genetics. So he was also looking at fossils. A lot of people don't know about his fossil research. He found these fossils of these extinct, weird, awesome, cute little fluff balls that have like an armored shell. And he noticed, so these were fossils on the left, and he noticed that they were a lot like armadillos, which are on the right. And the fossils that he found were high up in the Andes Mountains, which is in South America. So he thought that was weird. He was like, okay, so fossils resemble modern day animals. That's interesting too. And then he also saw differences in sea level. And so he saw fossils in different layers of rock that were once underwater, and saw that this was evidence of an earthquake. So he was making all these really profound observations. And he saw that things were changing and in like geology, and he thought also that things were changing in living things, and they weren't always like this, like they could have changed. And so here's some of your questions from section 2. The difference in the physical traits of an individual from those of other individuals is called, so that would be variation. You have these on your worksheets too, so you can check yourself here. Over time, adaptations can lead populations to experience what? What can adaptations cause populations to experience? So it'd be genetic changes. What did Charles Darwin observe in finch populations on the Galapagos off the coast of South America? So what did he see on these different islands of the finches? And I didn't talk about the finches on this. I don't have the file I normally use here. But he found that these finches all had different beak sizes. Some of them had really skinny beaks, and they ate little like bugs. And then some of them had really big, robust, strong beaks, and they ate nuts that nobody else could crack. And so he saw them on different parts of the islands. So that indicates that these were different species, and maybe they were related to each other. And then what did he think from the fossils of giant armadillos in Argentina? What was he thinking that meant? So he thought maybe modern day armadillos could be related to fossilized ones. They might be their ancestors. And then fossils of marine organisms high in the Andes Mountains led Darwin to conclude what? So what did he think about those marine fossils that belong in the ocean and they were way up high? That maybe an earthquake caused this and great change can happen. All right, so that's section 2. Now we'll go into section 3, and this is where Darwin is like finally making sense of all of this and trying to come up with how can I explain this, these observations. So he knew that humans were doing selective breeding. What that means is like what we do with cattle. Like if I need a lower birth weight, I'm going to pick a bull that is known to its family produces calves with a lower birth weight. And so eventually my calves will have a lower birth weight in my herd. So they were doing this with animals back then. They were breeding them for different traits. And you can see these goofy birds here that were all related to a pigeon, just that pigeon there. And humans used artificial breeding, artificial selection to do that. And so he thought, okay, if humans are doing this, what if this happens like naturally in nature? So he called, like, this was called artificial selection, and he called it natural selection if it was happening in nature. And so here are some of the main parts of this. So natural selection would just be the mechanism that would cause these adaptations to change. This is just how they change. And it can be that the environment is putting pressure on them. So one thing that we need to look at is the trait heritable? Can it actually be passed down, or did I just cut my arm off? Like, is it actually a genetic trait? And then we're also looking for if this trait makes them survive better. And then we're also looking for if there's overpopulation, like a whole bunch of them are produced and there's not enough resources, so only the best ones are going to survive. I think we probably have a good handle on how natural selection occurs. These are the 4 main principles that he derived from this that you should write down. The first one is variation, and that just means that different organisms are different. Like, I am not the same as anyone else. I have different traits than other people. The second principle is overproduction. That means that we make tons of babies, and that allows for only the best ones to survive in this mechanism of natural selection. And then adaptation is where some of those traits are better than others, and they're going to help that organism survive and reproduce. And then the last one is descent with modification. Oh, it's covered up there. But that means that the traits can be passed down. Okay. So natural selection can only act on traits that exist. Natural selection is not going to cause new traits to pop up. It's only going to act on the traits that already exist in the population. And sometimes a new structure will form just randomly, like an extra thumb. If you look at this panda bear, some panda bear somewhere got an extra thumb, and that allowed them to start using it differently, and then they could start using their hands in different ways. So that's an example of how an adaptation can be advantageous and help them, and sometimes it can be bad. So here are your questions for section 3. The development of scientists of a new color in a rose is the result of what? So if humans are changing the color of the rose and breeding roses, which is fun to do, what would we call that? Well, that would be artificial selection. Okay, in natural selection, the selective agent is the what? So in artificial selection, it's the human, but what is it in natural selection? What's causing these changes and pressure? And that would be the environment. All of the rabbits in a particular area would be an example of what? And this goes all the way back to chapter like 14 at the beginning of the year in ecology. So what would we call all the rabbits in a particular area that can breed with each other? And that would be a population. We had different levels of that. We had like population, community, ecosystem, and biome. A bird that can easily outcompete other birds for food and that can reproduce many eggs has a high what? You might have to look these words up. We didn't have all of these words there in the PowerPoint. And this would be fitness. Fitness is not like how fit you are if you go to the gym. Evolutionary fitness is whether you have babies that are fertile. Which of the following describes natural selection? And it's really good that we have a chance to really get this term straight, because you hear it a lot. Like, if I'm driving to town and I hit a bird, I think to myself, natural selection, but is that really the best? Like, is that really what it is? Even with COVID-19, sometimes I've heard people say that, which can be kind of a dangerous way to think about it. So natural selection is, it acts on existing traits. All right, now we're on to section 4. Let me take a drink while you look at this one. Okay, so now we're kind of moving away from Darwin, and we're looking at what is the evidence for how these different species are related, and how different organisms can kind of diverge. And there's different types of evidence that we look at, but I wanted to start with this picture. This is a pretty fun one. One way that we can study evolution is by looking at embryos. When organisms are just teeny babies, maybe they're still in the egg or in the womb. So these are different organisms, and I don't think I have the answer on this slide, but which one do you think is the human? You can take a minute and look. Obviously, it's not E. That one's fake, and I don't actually have the answers on here. Oh, I went too far, but I think that it's D. I think it's D, and you can check me on that. I think B is a snake or a reptile. A is a bird. C might be, I kind of see some fins here on its head. It might be a amphibian. And then F is probably a different type of mammal. So I'm going to guess that it's D, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, if you can find this picture. But this is one way where we can look at how organisms are related, because if their embryos are similar, that means that they were once related. They have a genome that's similar, and that they have a common ancestor. So the first things that we look at, I have a lot of writing on here. The first things we look at that Darwin looked at for evidence for evolution was fossils. And we just looked at how similar they were. They're not living now, so we can't look at their genetics, but we can see if they're similar or not. These are on the left here, where it says fossilize. These are the factors that we need to fossilize something. And we need it to have a quick burial. We need it to be preserved and not rot. We don't want bacteria to get to it, or scavengers. And it has to have hard parts like bones or shells. So a lot of like the really soft organisms don't fossilize well, and the conditions have to be just perfect. We know that not everything that dies fossilizes. So sometimes it is really hard to get like information about fossils. We also know that the older layers are usually going to be on the bottom, and then the newer layers are on top. So like if I have a stack of newspapers in my kitchen, I know that the oldest ones are on the bottom and the newest ones are on top because I stacked them. And I'm going to skip this entropy stuff here, so you can just ignore the right side. If you want to learn more about that, read about entropy with evolution. Okay, so the second piece of evidence, and this is another subtitle in your book, is the study of geography. We look at geography to see how closely organisms are related, and we also can look at it with COVID-19, and that's a hint for your worksheet, because your worksheet application question is a little bit tricky. So we see here that there are these two finches. One is on Isla Santa Cruz, and one is on Isla Española. They look really similar. So when we see two organisms that are geographically close and they look similar, we think, and if they, especially if they resemble a mainland one, we say these were probably related, and they probably diverged into two species. Just like we're seeing with COVID-19 right now, I think it's diverged into 8 strains. So sometimes we see things diverge so much that they become different species, and we'll have more on that in chapter 11 for sure. Okay, embryology is the next thing that we look at, which I showed you at the beginning. And this isn't the best picture. I have a better one coming up. But if we look at these two different organisms, on the left is a crab, on the right is a barnacle, which is this really weird, like shell, weird creature that doesn't have any legs, and it's super weird. Their larvae look almost the same. So for a long time, people did not think crabs and barnacles were at all related until they saw their larvae. And then they were like, oh my gosh, they look exactly the same as babies, and then they diverge. So now they're in the same phylum, Arthropoda. And they're not in this, they're not in any further down than that. So yeah, so now we know that they're really similar. We are also more, get this, we are more related to sea stars like starfish than we are to insects. And that's because of our embryos. Our embryos are more similar to sea star embryos than they are to insect embryos. So we base a lot on what the embryos look like. And here's some cute little embryos. These are actually labeled so you can see if the human one, we were probably looking at the second one there, right here with the human on that first picture. So you can see if I'm right. But we start here at the top at the youngest embryos. They all look pretty much the same. They have like a weird funny head and they have vertebrae and a tail. These are all vertebrates. So starting out, they look really similar. And then as they get older, they start to diverge. The absolute cutest one ever, and you can't argue with me, the cutest one is the baby turtle. Like baby turtles are one of the cutest organisms on the planet for babies. And this little baby embryonic turtle with its little baby shell and its little baby arms and its little birdie mouth is really adorable. So you can see what the other ones look like. We have fish, salamander, we have the baby sweet turtle, a little cute chick, a little bird, and then we have a pig, calf, rabbit, and human. And you can see that they, like those mammals look pretty similar. So from that, we would say like these are probably, some of these are more closely related than others. So that's what we learned from embryology. We also look at anatomy. So anatomy is looking at the body parts of organisms, maybe like their arms, their legs, their inside guts, and we're comparing those to see how closely related they are. And sometimes this can be misleading, and that's why now we have genetics also. But we have some different terms here. One type of structure that we look at is called homologous. Homologous means the same. So I'm going to show you some pictures here of homologous structures, but what you need to know here is that these structures are evidence of a common ancestor. That means that they are related to each other. So here are some pictures of that. The human hand, a mole foot, and a bat wing. We know bats are mammals. I don't particularly love them, but their little hand here, and if you can see where I'm pointing, the top here of their little wing, that's their wrist. And then it goes out to their fingers. So their wings are actually their fingers, and then you have their little arm bone here. And then same thing with the mole. The mole has the same exact arm bones that we do, and here's our hand with our arm bones. And here's another way to look at that. So if we focus on the human, which is over on the left, and then scooch over to the bat, I was showing you that that little top part of the wing is the wrist, and you can see the teeny weeny wrist bones, and then you can see the fingers actually make the wing. Also look at the whale. It has a really short arm bone. The humerus is really short. The radius and ulna are also really short compared to the human arm. And then it has the wrist bones and then some phalanges. And then this is a bird. It's going to have similar structure. A cat looks like us. And a horse, look at this. A horse has got a short humerus, longer, that would be the radius, and the ulna is kind of vestigial there. Here's the wrist, which looks like the knee of the horse. And then the finger is actually the leg, like the bottom part of the leg. So it's actually running around on its middle finger. And then the chestnuts are the other fingers that are, I'm not trying to be rude, but the chestnuts are the little things on the leg that you peel off. If you guys have ever looked at horse legs, like kind of calluses, those are the vestigial fingernails, and the hoof is the fingernail. So those are homologous traits. This is evidence that all of these are related to each other. So that's pretty cool. Analogous traits are the opposite. Analogous traits show that these organisms are not related. They look the same, they have the same job, but they're not related. And so these are not evidence of common ancestors. I asked you some questions on the worksheet like this. I don't want you to be tricked. I want you to know that analogous traits do not show common ancestors and homologous traits do. So don't get tricked there. Here's an example. Fly wings, bat wings, these are not related to each other. They're super distantly related. Flies are invertebrates, bats are vertebrates. Just because they both have wings and they like kind of look similar, you could also put birds in there. Those are not closely related, even though they have wings. Okay. The last type of anatomical structure is vestigial. Vestigial structures are structures that we have that aren't really used anymore. And ostrich wings are a good example. So this is an example that these are related to other birds, but they've diverged from them since. Some examples of our vestigial structures would be our appendix. That would be in other organisms, it would be like the cecum. On horses, it would be really big and functional. Ours isn't. The tear ducts, the little tissue right here. You know how like reptiles have that nictitating membrane that go over and like it's like a clear eyelid, an extra eyelid. That's a vestigial structure there. Trying to think of other ones we have. Whales have hips. Snakes have hips. Those are vestigial. They don't need those. I'm drawing a blank. There's a lot of other ones. So I'm going to show you the questions now, and you can go through these or skip them. Which of the following is an example of a vestigial structure? So these are structures that are not used anymore, and they're evidence of a common ancestor that were passed down but not used. So wings of red-tailed hawks. Well, I know that hawks use their wings to fly, so that wouldn't make sense. Hind limbs of a house cat. They use their hind limbs to run and jump. Fins of a shark. They also use their fins to swim in as a warning. And then wings of an ostrich. Well, they don't use their wings. They can't fly. They're too large. So that would be vestigial. So would our appendix and snake hips. Biogeography is the study of what? Distribution of organisms around the world, environments around the world, different types of rocks around the world, and age of fossils around the world. And if you didn't know anything about this word, you could break it down into bio and geography, and you would know that it was A. What is suggested by the similarity of early embryos of different species of vertebrates? So no evolutionary relationship between groups, recent common ancestry, similar environments in the past, or distant, or evolution from a distant common ancestor. So your best answer there would be D. Then we have some organisms that share a common ancestor have features that have different functions but share similar structures. These are known as what? So they share a common ancestor. That means it's not analogous. These structures have different functions, like a whale fin and a human hand, but they have the same bones. The bones are just in a different shape. Those would be homologous structures. If an organism has a vestigial structure, that structure likely once had a function in what? So remember, a vestigial structure is one that we don't use anymore, like our appendix maybe, or snake hips, or ostrich wings. And so they had a function in an early ancestor, but not anymore. Okay, so now we'll go on to section 5. Section 5 is like current evolutionary biology stuff. What's happening today? And this is what they're using to study COVID-19 for sure. So here's our big picture for this. If they have more similar DNA, if their DNA sequence is more similar, they're more related. That's our big picture. For COVID-19, it has RNA. So we're looking at its RNA. Okay. So one current thing that we're looking at is paleontology, and this is a big whale, I think. And so that's one picture that they're showing in your book, and how we can look at how that's similar to extant or living organisms too. So here's an example of how paleontology can help us to learn about evolution. A lot of times we are looking at transition fossils. Remember that not everything fossilizes, and it's really hard to find fossils, and not everything fossilizes, and not everything fossilizes, and it has to be perfect conditions. So we were able to find this example of a transition species where 40 million years ago you have this Doradon. You can see these little tiny legs here. And then more distantly in the past, we have bigger legs. And then even more distantly, we have these weight-bearing legs. So the middle one here would be more aquatic. The top one would definitely be aquatic. And then more distant, longer ago, we have this one. And then even longer ago, we have weight-bearing, but still somewhat aquatic based on the mouth shape, I would say. And so this is supportive evolution because you can see how they've changed and they have really similar skulls and structures. And these little hips here are turning vestigial. So when we can find things like that, we can really learn more about them and about evolution. We also look at molecular evidence. And so we're looking at their DNA and their genetics, just like we do with COVID-19 with those graphs I showed you. If we have two organisms that have more similar DNA, they're more closely related. So here's an example between a hippo and a humpback whale. And remember that this is just a teensy bit of DNA. It's kind of meaningless. But you can see here that the sequence is almost the same. There's just a couple letters that are different. The T and C, the C and G here, let me point. And then over here, I see this G and C are different, but pretty much the same. So if we're looking at that, this is molecular evidence, and the two are pretty similar. We also can look for pseudogenes. Pseudogenes mean fake genes, kind of. Pseudo means fake. And these are genes that maybe used to function. They're kind of like vestigial. They used to function, but they probably don't anymore. And they were carried along with functional DNA. So they kind of hitched a ride and they were passed down, but they don't really function. These can be clues to a common ancestor. So if you see organisms that have the same pseudogenes, or maybe they were functional in this ancestor and not in these, you can see that those might be related. We also look at Hox genes. Hox genes are called body plan genes, and this tells your body where to put different structures. They're also called homeobox genes. These are found in many organisms, from insects all the way to humans. They all have Hox genes. And they tell you your body where to put like your head and your arms and your legs. And then another thing that we look at is protein comparisons. So we actually look at their proteins to see how similar they are. If they have more proteins in common, they're more closely related. Okay. So the last idea here is that evolution really does unite all fields in biology and even fields outside of biology, because they're all pointing to the same thing. They're all pointing to the fact that organisms have changed over time due to random mutations and environmental changes. And some examples of that, we looked at fossil evidence, we looked at embryos, we looked at anatomy, we looked at molecular, we looked at geography. Those are like kind of your 5 things, and they all support the same idea that organisms change. And so here's a nice picture of a humpback whale. And so I'll show you the quiz questions now. If you want to skip them, you can. Paleontology is the study of, that would be fossils. 2 organisms that are closely related would have what? So if they're closely related, they're going to have very similar DNA. And then what are pseudogenes? So those are the gene sequences that no longer function, and you can think of fake genes, but that's not really the best translation. Evolution is considered to be one of the most important theories in science because it does what? This was our last slide here with the whale. Yeah, and so it unites all the fields of biology, geology, chemistry, and ecology. Protein sequences in one organism that resemble those in another suggest a what? So if they have shared or similar protein sequences, they probably have a shared ancestry. So that's the whole section. I hope that helps, and let me know if you have questions. And make sure you do all your worksheets. See you next time.